Hello everyone, welcome back. We're going to take a look at the big 4 decks in the meta and discuss how each can be tweaked and improved to get an edge over the competition. And since everyone loves top 5 lists, I'll also give my thoughts on which deck deserves that 5th spot in the top 5. So if you're gearing up for your Ursula's Return set championships or headed to a big regional Lorcana challenge, hopefully this video will help you get an edge over the competition. So let's dive in and talk about the top 5 meta decks in Lorcana. Well, it's no secret that there are 4 decks that have been the dominant forces in the set 4 meta. These are Emerald Steel, Ruby Sapphire, Sapphire Steel, and Ruby Amethyst. These 4 decks have dominated events and conversation pretty much for the entirety of Lorcana Set 4. Depending on who you ask, or simply which event or weekend you play at, any one of these 4 decks has proven it can rise to the top. Today I'm going to walk through why each of these decks is a true top contender, and why each of them in their own way is worthy of the number 1 spot they're all fighting for. I'm going to start with some tried and true consistent lists, briefly go through each deck's plan for anyone new, and then dive into more competitive details such as the interactions and matchups between each top deck. This will include going over different tech options and newer emerging strategies for each deck. And honestly, there has been quite a bit of movement in different lists as each deck settles into more of a final form. We are well into the set now, and all these weeks of testing and tournament events have no doubt resulted in compounded improvements for each deck. But enough of this intro, you guys get the idea. Let's talk about our first deck. Let's start with Emerald Steel, with everyone's favorite Bucky Floodborn discard deck. Regardless of where this deck lands in the top 4 discussion, I want to start this video breaking down this Bucky deck because it's sort of the cornerstone of Set 4, meaning that every other deck in the format tends to make decisions because of this deck. Now that can certainly be said for any of the top 4 decks. After all, any top list has to keep tools in mind for dealing with the other opposing decks, but I think Emerald Steel demands a bit more attention due to its discard-based strategy, since it often requires a specific play pattern as a response. In other words, when a fast, disruptive deck like this is popular, discussions and decisions surrounding other top decks are at least partly going to focus on answering this deck's threats and game plan. And I think we have seen that clearly, especially earlier on in this Set 4 season, if you will. So let's break down Emerald Steel first, before we get into some of the other decks in the top 5, since I'll be referencing back here quite a bit. So you've likely already noticed that this is a very standard stock list I have here. I want to start with something strong and consistent, and then I'll get to some more interesting ideas and options, as well as some newer inclusions that deserve some attention. So as a brief overview, this Emerald Steel deck aims to win through a combination of disruptive card advantage and extreme early game value. This card advantage is of course gained through card draw and opponent discard, primarily through a turn 2 Bucky into a turn 3 Diablo or other Floodborn character. These characters activate Bucky and cause your opponent to discard a card, and this is then pushed further with subsequent Floodborn characters being played out. Alongside all that, impactful early game value and tempo is achieved through those Floodborn characters shifting in, as well as songs being sung for free. The value provided from all this allows this deck to get ahead of the opponent right out of the gate. You'll notice both of these game plans involve early Floodborn characters. Of course, they are a core component because of their synergy with Bucky Squirrelspeak Tutor, but even on his own, Diablo Devoted Herald in particular is extremely strong. Not only does he draw you cards when your opponent does on their turn, he can also sing great 3-cost songs as well. A turn 1 Diablo Maleficent Spy makes shifting into Floodborn Diablo on turn 3 after the turn 2 Bucky even more deadly. With this line you can sing immediately, which also turns Diablo so you draw going into the opponent's turn. Floodborn Flynn Rider and Robin Hood can also be played on turn 3, as they can shift in for only 3 ink, and they can sing powerful songs up to 4 and 5 cost respectively. And another turn 3 Floodborn is Aladdin Brave Rescuer. His ability to banish items can be game-changing against Sapphire decks, to the point where prioritizing him in hand during those matchups has become a go-to strategy. Heading up the curve, a couple copies of Jafar Dreadnought join Floodborn Flynn at the 4-cost level, and at 5, Floodborn Robin Hood is joined by everyone's favorite Tragic Beast. In addition to all the Bucky Floodborn synergy, the 1-2 punch combo of Ursula Deceiver and Ursula Deceiver of All join the deck. Both of these cards add so much utility to the list, from targeted discard to explosive steal damage. Ursula Deceiver of All can join in on the discard game plan by double singing Sudden Chill, but she also combos perfectly with our 3-cost Steel songs, of course. As mentioned, this deck also has some 4 and 5-cost songs, and Then Along Came Zeus can hit characters, but it's also key for helping take down locations like the Queen's Castle. And I personally like a couple copies of We Don't Talk About Bruno. It can be brutally effective when your opponent's hand is empty, and it's also one of your best answers if you find yourself having to fight back against something like Tamatoa in the mid-game. Finally, Hidden Cove joins in as a tech card against Ruby decks. It boosts character stats, so Medusa and Empowered Sisu will have a lot more trouble clearing out your characters while they're at the Cove, as they'll need to find and combo with an Ice Block or similar ability to hit your key characters. Otherwise, a character like Maui must be found and used to take down that Hidden Cove first. This location can also help in the mirror match, as a boosted Diablo can take down an enemy evasive like another Diablo while still surviving. This deck list as a whole is really solid, and there's really not that many emerging developments for this list. It's been played and tested a ton, and it's placed well in dozens of important events. But in order to keep up week to week, alongside other decks that are learning and adapting, you have to adapt yourself. So let's get into some different options for this deck. As far as Bucky combos go, another popular choice worth mentioning for a turn 3 shift is the Emerald Pegasus line with Baby Pegasus and Pegasus Cloud Racer. These can be great additions, and many players are huge fans of their inclusion. So here's what I consider the pros and cons. Pegasus immediately adds more aggression to this deck, and he does legitimately provide a lot more consistency for the Bucky discard combos. If you manage to get your Bucky for your turn 2 every mulligan, Pegasus feels absolutely fantastic. Plus, the 1-drop Pegasus can be quite impactful even on his own. However, adding even more pressure to find that singular main combo piece of Bucky can be frustrating when you don't hit. And in those scenarios, Ursula Deceiver of All can come in clutch as a secondary strategy. Plus, she's an incredible defensive choice like I mentioned earlier. I bring up Ursula because the majority of lists that run Pegasus tend to cut out Ursula and Sudden Chill in order to fit the 6 to 8 Pegasus cards into the deck. So if that's the choice you have to make, I think I'd take Ursula almost every time. She diversifies your ways to discard your opponent's cards, but her ability to double sing steal damage cards is really where her value lies. In particular, she shines in the mirror match and against pretty much any aggro deck you can think of. So I suppose if you predict that you're one of the only Emerald Steel players at some event, you could cut her for other cards, but other than that scenario, I like her a lot in this deck. Speaking of the mirror match, 2 great considerations are Grab Your Sword and Tinkerbell Giant Fairy. These are pretty obvious, as they help take out opposing Buckies and Diablos, and of course Tinkerbell extends your Floodborn synergy into the 6-cost slot. This naturally helps your mid-game, but it might slow down your early game a bit, since you may find her instead of another crucial card. Baboom is also good in the mirror, but it also provides some flexibility fighting against Ruby Amethyst in particular, contributing towards location damage, as well as knocking out their pesky Frenemy Flynn riders. This is an especially important consideration if you decide to drop that Ursula Deceiver of All out of the list. Now, I do think there is perhaps some room to consider other turn 4 questers in this deck, something like Evasive Tinkerbell or Hey Hey Bumbling Rooster. These provide some unique utilities against evasive decks and sapphire decks respectively, and they actually help speed this deck up as it can be surprisingly slow in the lore department. I like these options, however I don't think these picks are impactful enough to make the list just yet. In fact, I really think the stock Emerald Steel deck list here is super tight, and I really wouldn't recommend changing much. If anything, I might do something like this, simply swapping out the 1-drop Flynn Riders in favor of a couple big Tinks. It's not much, but I do think the process of making small tweaks and considering different ideas like this is the process by which new, meaningful progress can be made with such an established deck. Now before we dive into the other decks, let's quickly cover matchups for Bucky discard because I think it's a pretty interesting discussion. On paper, there's a lot of decks that feel good fighting into Emerald Steel. Other steel decks like Sapphire Steel, Amber Steel, and Amethyst Steel can all do well by taking down Bucky or Diablo with Grab Your Sword or pretty much any other steel card. And I also find that Ruby Sapphire also does well against Bucky so long as they ink and draw properly to survive the early game and discard pressure. And yet, despite that list of difficult matchups, Emerald Steel is still alive and thriving, and still finds itself with strong results. As it turns out, discarding your opponent's hand is simply a really good way to shut down important lines that would otherwise give them control of the game. Who would have guessed? With that said, I do think players are continuing to improve against this deck week after week, and it's possible that the golden era of Emerald Steel in Set 4 is behind us. Let me know what you think about that in the comments. One thing is for sure though, this deck is undeniably powerful and it certainly has earned its spot in the top 5. Alright, let's move on to our next deck. Let's talk about Ruby Sapphire. I like to call this control deck Ice Dragon Control. Again, I have a simple list to start off with here. But trust me, I know there's been a lot of movement, especially lately with Ruby Sapphire lists, and we'll get into all that soon, but let me first give a quick overview of the deck. Ruby Sapphire combines together the deadly duo of Sapphire Inkwell Ramp with Ruby removal that takes over late games. And Ruby really does provide some insane control potential, with cards like Sisu, Maleficent Dragon, and Be Prepared as high cost, high impact cards that shut down your opponent's efforts to set up characters. Other cards like Brawl and Madame Medusa come out a bit earlier and help against early game threats, but can also be flexible later in the game. Maui is also here as an all-time MVP in Ruby that can take out most characters, but he's also a critical inclusion in today's meta as he helps fight back against one of this deck's biggest weaknesses, locations. Alongside all this Ruby power, Sapphire comes in to provide a nice item-based draw engine with Flaversham. This of course utilizes popsicles, and even cards like Tamatoa to recycle those popsicles and other items. Tamatoa also threatens to end games himself by comboing with the amazing / infuriating Lucky Dime. At a certain point, the combination of Ruby removal plus the looming threat of Lucky Dime ending games simply becomes way too much for any other deck to manage, which is why this deck is the absolute control king of Lorcana. You don't want to be playing a long game against this deck. Now all this is fine and dandy, but with so many high cost cards and so many uninkable cards in this deck, Sapphire really comes in clutch as the perfect enabler. Sapphire allows this deck to quickly ramp up the Inkwell to play those strong cards even sooner. The primary tools for this are 1 Jump Ahead and How Far I'll Go, as well as the amazing item Fishbone Quill, which significantly helps with ink ramp, but also negates some of the issues that come with such a high uninkable count in this list. Hopefully that's a serviceable overview for anyone new, but I have a feeling everyone watching already knows this deck well, so let's look at some new ideas for Ruby Sapphire. Like I was saying in the beginning, this is, in my opinion, the most consistent and to-the-point list you can make for this deck. But there are a lot of important considerations to cover. First of all, if you want to trim a few cards to open up some room for new ideas, one of the first things that can be done is to drop the 4 copies of Develop Your Brain in favor of more impactful cards. Additionally, you have some wiggle room to shave 1 off of Grandma Tala, How Far I'll Go, Ice Block, or even Madame Medusa. So keep those areas in mind as we go through some card options. Now real quick, why would you want to trim those cards? In particular those 4 Develop Your Brains, which we have definitely been seeing cut in a lot of lists. After all, Develop is essentially a card that fills space in the deck, but in a very efficient way. Once you've ramped up in ink a bit and have some card draw, 4 copies of Develop Your Brain, for the most part, transforms this deck into a streamlined 56 card list. However, despite that nice consistency, Ruby Sapphire just simply has so many good cards that cutting those 4 in favor of even more juice has proven to be an effective decision. So let's get right to it and start with an obvious tech card that could be added, Judy Hopps. Judy is a strong character. She's cheap, quests for 2, and destroys an item when played. Sometimes you can use her to draw off your own items in place of Flaversham, but really she's primarily a tech card for the mirror match or against Sapphire Steel, as she can take down an opposing lucky dime. She isn't an auto inclusion for every list because sometimes it just doesn't do enough. After all, Tamatoa can just find that lucky dime again whenever he's played out or when he quests, but Judy can sometimes stall at a crucial moment that can decide the entire trajectory of the game. As I mentioned, one of the major weaknesses of this deck is that it has problems with locations. More specifically, it struggles against Ruby Amethyst because of the aggressive early line of Frenemy Flynn into Sisu into Queen's Castle. This line provides some real pressure that demands a split response. You can take out Flynn and/or Sisu, or you can take out the Queen's Castle, but it's very difficult to take out both characters and locations at once. And if played out early in the game like this, it's near impossible to answer. To help fight back, I suggest testing Vitalisphere and Hercules' Daring Demigod. Vitalisphere helps add 2 strength onto Maui, while still synergizing with Flaversham for card draw and Tamatoa for lore. That 2 strength plus rush can be useful on other characters as well, but Maui is the key target, so he can boost up above 7 strength to take down the Queen's Castle. And this is also why Hercules is growing in popularity. He effectively functions as a 5th Maui, who doesn't need a Vitalisphere to help him take down a castle. But he is uninkable, so adding him in does mean you'll need to find room for that swap. Similarly, Great Stone Dragon is an item that has gotten some attention as a complement or replacement for Fishbone Quill. Being able to ink from your discard instead of your hand is truly useful against almost every matchup. Against discard, it's an obvious plus since inking from hand with a quill simply speeds up the discard agenda. Great Stone Dragon also functions well against other mid-range and control-style decks. It's nice to ink a resource that's already been spent, which means you don't use up those resources in your hand, so they're ready to be played as intended. I don't think a full-out replacement of Fishbone Quill is wise, but I do like the idea of Great Stone Dragon as a 5th Fishbone Quill, or perhaps running a 3-2 split. In terms of removal, I think Let It Go is a bit underutilized. Because it's singable and can hit any non-ward character, it's basically a better Brawl that only costs 2 more ink. Brawl can certainly save games against certain matchups. It's perfect for taking down Diablos and Flavershams, but if you can manage to ramp into Let It Go consistently, I think it could be considered a replacement for at least a couple copies of Brawl. Other strong removal options are Be King Undisputed and Lady Tremaine. These have the valuable ability to hit ward characters as long as they are solo on the board, and this can massively help against other Sapphire decks. Against Sapphire Steel, ward characters Cogsworth and Aerial Treasure Collector can be taken down this way without relying on Be Prepared. Also in the Ruby Sapphire mirror match, cards like Be King Undisputed and Lady Tremaine are great later on when you get caught in that cycle of trading Tamatoas and dragons back and forth. If you've played in the mirror, then you know exactly what I mean. Like Hercules though, these cards are uninkable, so finding a way to swap them in is a major struggle here. Finally, here's a few more slept on options. I've been playing Fang Crossbow in this deck for a long time, and I still think it's a great card. You can replace an ice block with one of these, and it can really put in work. I know it costs 3 ink plus the 2 extra to use it, but if you've never tried this, I encourage you to give it a shot. Just 1 copy as a flexible item addition. Now, the idea of testing one-off items can be pushed even further though. If you're going to consider splashing in a single Fang Crossbow, it's only natural to also consider a Fish Hook or Shield of Virtue. These 2 items are great tech options against locations, and Shield can sometimes straight up win you the game by turning and protecting a valuable dime target like Tamatoa or Sisu. And all of these items become even more valuable if you want to test out a Maurice's Workshop angle, which provides another source of item-based card draw. Now let's slow down and acknowledge that this particular flavor of Ruby Sapphire isn't one that's proven itself with results, so I'm not going to hard recommend it here, but I do think we've stumbled into a realm of some underutilized ideas here that have some unique potential. Now, with all that said, here's a look at a strong Ice Dragon control list that utilizes some of those options I mentioned without getting too wacky. Overall, I love this deck, and I really think a list like this has what it takes to go far. Next up, we have Sapphire Steel. This is a very strong deck that feels like it's a hybrid of so many great meta components right now. It has great defenses without compromising powerful game-ending combos, and this makes it a flexible threat with a high ceiling of potential. Sapphire Steel takes the Flaversham card draw ideas with Popsicle and doubles down with Fortisphere. This boosted card draw engine leads to all the Sapphire goodness we just discussed in Ruby Sapphire with Fishbone Quill, Lucky Dime, and Tamatoa. This time around, Cogsworth joins the party. Not only does he provide resist to your board, but his ward keyword is very strong, protecting him while he poises to sing a song like A Whole New World on the next turn, or simply protecting him while he provides 2 lore to a Lucky Dime. In a similar way, Aerial Treasure Collector joins as a major threat paired with Lucky Dime. She provides 5 lore as long as you have more items than the opponent. This is similar to the classic 5 lore from Belle Strange but Special, but with a 3/4 stat line plus ward, she can't be hit by targeted removal, and the stats protect her from Sisu and Grab Your Sword. In addition to all this, we can't forget the steal components of this deck. Some early aggression is present here with Mr. Smee, and we have a solid anti-evasive character with the Flying Magic Broom. Hard-Headed Beast helps with items, and Giant Tink is an all-time powerhouse that has to be included. I personally like running 2 Baboom and 3 And Then Along Came Zeus. These can hit either characters or locations, which is great, and I also think Rise of the Titans is a lot more valuable than players realize. It has some very strong targets inside any deck in the Big Four, even against Emerald Steel, which only runs Hidden Cove. This can be pretty impactful, and even if it isn't, that matchup already feels fine, and this is still an inkable card. I think what really sets this deck apart is that this ink pairing feels like somewhat of a rogue choice that has everything it needs to be sort of the anti-meta pick. After all, Sapphire Steel does have the tools to fight back against the 2 decks we just discussed prior. Against Bucky Discard, it's a bit obvious. These steel actions can take down characters like Diablo, while Sapphire ramps up into that Lucky Dime win condition. And against pretty much any steel deck, Cogsworth can really make your board unassailable, but his ward keyword also makes him super useful against Ruby Sapphire. Speaking of which, against Red-Blue, you can often beat them to finding Lucky Dime because of easier to achieve card draw. With double the 1-cost draw items, thanks to Fortisphere, you can quickly filter through your deck to find what you need. Combine this with Flaversham plus even A Whole New World, and you can find that dime quick, and strike first with a lethal lore combo. Now do keep in mind that A Whole New World can backfire against Ruby decks specifically, as it can hand them another quiver of insane removal. However, if they have a fat hand already, it can be useful to equalize the resources on both sides while discarding all that gas out of their hand. Now, while we're discussing A Whole New World, there are some great performing lists that leave that card out completely. Here's a look at an example now. This iteration leans into the item-heavy nature of the deck, with 2 copies of Maurice's Workshop for card draw. Importantly, this does open up room for 2 more cards. In this case, I added a 3rd Baboom and a 4th Grab Your Sword. You'll also notice that 1 Jump Ahead is swapped out for Mickey Detective. This choice is really up for debate, but I like 1 Jump a bit less when I don't feel as much pressure to use A Whole New World early to reset my hand. And Mickey also feels better as a top deck later in the game, even though neither really feels all that great. Now, there are some real Sapphire Steel experts out there that understand the nuances between the Whole New World lists and the non-Whole New World lists a lot better. But if you want to know my opinion, I still swing pretty heavily in favor of running A Whole New World. It's a powerful card, and it gives this deck a power spike that can really give it the edge in critical games. Not only does it help this deck even more against discard, you have to remember Lucky Dime is a crucial win condition against decks like Ruby Sapphire, and I consider A Whole New World to be an important component to that strategy. The sheer punchiness it provides that allows you to quickly find what you need on a dime is very impactful and shouldn't be overlooked. There are definitely some times where a whole new world benefits your opponent, but I think this comes down to having the patience and control to know when to play it and when to hold back and push your advantage in a different way. Now, I do think that non-whole new world decks are great to keep in mind though. These are potentially the future of this deck and may continue to rise to the top quickly as the format shifts. And as I was saying, many Sapphire Steel experts prefer the non-whole new world angle already, so I suggest looking into gameplay and rationale of some other players if you like the idea of playing Sapphire Steel. Alright, now it's time for the fourth deck in our list, the final of the big four, Ruby Amethyst, a classic combo since set 1. And ever since set 1, Ruby Amethyst has pretty much never failed to meet its own high expectations, no matter what meta we find ourselves in. This is still true right now, despite some whispers early on of Ruby Amethyst being dead in set 4. It's clear by now that was and is far from the truth. Ruby Amethyst is still out here thriving. As a quick overview of the deck, the pairing of Ruby and Amethyst provides a potent mix of card draw and disruption, all empowered by high-impact bounce effects from Madam Mim. In the mid-game, this deck often begins to take control over other decks that can't keep up in tempo. Brawl, Fox, Maui, and Medusa all help take down opposing threats, and you can threaten a snappy victory yourself with Merlin Goat as always. Bouncing him in and out of play to gain 1 lore each time is still a strong part of this deck's core identity. However, in set 4, Ruby injects yet another great lore engine into this deck, and we discussed it earlier when talking about the first 3 decks. This is the Flynn Rider Frenemy and Sisu Emboldened Warrior line. Flynn provides 3 lore at the beginning of your turn if you have a higher strength character on board compared to your opponent, and Sisu follows him up providing exactly what he needs, as her strength is boosted depending on the number of cards in your opponent's hand. Frenemy Flynn on 2 into Sisu on 3 is a powerful 2-card combo that has really revitalized Ruby Amethyst. Sisu is guaranteed to have high strength early on, so if Flynn is left unchecked and Sisu unrivaled in strength, the lore piles up pretty quick. Slam down a Queen's Castle next on turn 4, and suddenly lethal is on the horizon, with or without Merlin Goat. And keep in mind, throughout all of this, Ruby is providing defense with removal if needed, and Amethyst is happily weaving in card draw with Friends, Maleficent, Rabbit, and even some bonus card draw if you need it from Chernobog's followers, or even Queen's Castle itself. Although the castle is primarily used as a lore threat here, either on that turn 4 to curve out your early aggro line, or later on as an annoying threat once you've established some board control, or wiped it out completely with Be Prepared. More specifically, if you can set up these aggressive lines, it can be super difficult for Ruby Sapphire to deal with. If they take their first 4 or 5 turns setting up items, 1 jump ahead, Flaversham, Fishbone Quill, etc., then yes, they will likely board wipe you immediately afterwards. However, your Ruby Amethyst deck really has no problem setting up double-digit lore by that time. In fact, with 0 opponent response, hitting around 15 lore by turn 5 and threatening lethal is pretty consistent as long as you find that turn 2, 3, 4 sequence. Against a more traditional, pure character-focused aggro deck, Red-Blue can still often fight back because their removal and the ink to fuel it is all online. But against a diversified threat from Queen's Castle, it can really turn up the difficulty for them. After all, Maui is one of their only answers, and even then, without another character on board, he still takes 2 turns to clear out a single 7 willpower location. Now they do have other options to fight back. If you skipped down to here, you can go back to Ruby Sapphire, where I talk about how to tech into locations. But overall, the matchup feels good for the Ruby Amethyst player, and often that extends over into the Sapphire Steel decks as well. Now on the contrary, if we look at the Emerald Steel matchup, things are quite a bit more rough. As you probably know, playing against Emerald without Ruby or Steel can be a death wish. So fortunately we do have Ruby here, but unlike Ruby Sapphire with its ramp, Ruby Amethyst can't play out the Medusas and B preps nearly as fast. So hyper-aggressive discard coming out from Bucky and friends can really pile on the pain. This is why 4 copies of Brawl is such a vital component here. If Diablo is left unchecked, Emerald Steel can quickly take over the game, with card advantage as they empty your hand and draw cards themselves with Diablo. I certainly don't think it's an unwinnable matchup, but it can be a major uphill battle that needs to be navigated carefully, especially against a seasoned player. Let's talk about some card options though, starting with more ways to fight back against Emerald and other aggro decks. Something as simple as a few copies of Teeth and Ambitions can really put in some work. They simply join in with Brawl as an early game answer to small characters. Another option to hit evasives like Diablo is the inclusion of your own evasive character, like Peter Pan Shadowfinder, Peter Pan Shadow himself, or even Ruby Pegasus. I think out of these 3, Peter Pan Shadow feels best because he can also double function as a lore threat as well. But he does have to wait until turn 4 to come out, and he's uninkable, so it's really hard to justify his inclusion. These characters are worthy of consideration, but if I need extra answers for Diablo, I'd lean towards the Teeth and Ambitions first. Another important decision for this deck is deciding what, if any, 1-drops to play. In this list here, I've included 4 Chernobog's Followers, which I think is the clear winner right now for this deck in terms of 1-cost characters. Cutting them down to 4 or even less is going to be the next natural move for this deck. There are just so many other cards that you want to see and include, and right now in the meta, 1-cost characters are just not as vital as they usually are. One solution I like for the mirror match is playing a couple Vitalispheres at the 1-cost slot. They help take down rival locations, just like I discussed for Ruby Sapphire. Another early game consideration is Cusco. He's a decent turn 2 character if you can't find your Flynn Rider, and at first glance, he seems to be a pretty decent choice for the mirror match. After all, he feels good going against opposing B preps. However, if you play out Cusco while your opponent in the mirror match plays out their Flynn Rider, it's just simply losing unless you have that Sisu or Brawl ready to go. So although Cusco seems like a good fit in the mirror, he really doesn't work as a 2-turn character right now. Another idea for the mirror that I think is a bit more successful is the Sorcerer's Spellbook. As always, to me this feels like a sleeper pick. Spellbook has the ability to elevate this deck to a 3rd dimension of lore threat. With characters on board and locations, we would now have an item that also provides lore. You can see how this card could potentially catch players off guard and drive forwards towards victory. Now with all that considered, despite those choices, I think this deck is another one similar to Emerald Steel that feels just about solved in the current state of the meta. I don't think I'd change much in this deck list, and I think many Ruby Amethyst players would be quite happy with this current list. Alright, well that was our 4th deck so far, rounding out the big 4 of the meta. But in order to make this a top 5 video, we have to look past the big 4 and consider some other decks in the format. So what is that 5th deck in the meta right now? Out of all the contenders, I think there are 4 decks that have the best shot at disrupting the big 4. These are Emerald Amethyst Tempo, Amethyst Steel Midrange, Amber Ruby Mufasa, and Amber Steel Song. I think Emerald Amethyst and Ruby Mufasa are legitimately 2 of the best aggro style decks in the meta right now. I know in some ways they bleed into more of a mid-range and tempo style, and I know these 2 decks are not really all that similar at all, but when it all boils down, these decks simply want to hit the ground running and go fast. They just happen to draw cards in the process and do a good job of transitioning into the mid game. Much better than something that's more of a pure aggro deck. This is all also true for Amethyst Steel, as I think the most effective version of that deck is a hybrid list that has some elements of both aggro and mid-range. Of course, all 3 of these decks have unique ways of accomplishing all this. Amethyst Steel in particular has the ability to flex into some defensive options because of its access to rush characters, evasive characters, and damaging steel actions. I love how diverse Amethyst Steel is, and I truly believe there's many iterations of this Ink duo that can perform well. Everything from Floodborn combos with Blue Fairy, to more aggro lists with bouncing and bodyguards, down to more specific archetypes like Jafar decks or Broom decks. Now, some of these are clearly better than others, but I think it's neat how Amethyst Steel has, at least in my opinion, solidified itself as the most flexible ink duo in Lorcana. And if you tune an Amethyst Steel deck just right, it's proven it can do some damage. And I think it's up there in my ranking for sure. On the other hand, I think all that flexibility I mentioned does make it much harder to nail down the deck for peak competitive play. With so many playable cards and strategies to lean into, the nuances in list choices, even just between running a few cards or not, is difficult to overcome without a high level of understanding. At the end of the day, I think that amazing flexibility detracts a bit from its peak potential. Finally, Amber Steel is in the conversation as well, and it's been a fan favorite deck for a long time now. Despite that, it's been left out in the cold a bit in set 4, but I'm here to try to redeem it some, because I think if there is a number 5 deck in the meta right now, my personal pick would be Amber Steel. Now let's look back briefly at what I was just saying about Ruby Amethyst. It's strong because of those diversified threats, and I think Amber Steel is the master of diversified threats. That's right, with characters, items, and locations all showing up early to begin stacking lore, Amber Steel does a great job of spreading its targets out. Pair this with steel removal, card draw options, and more, and this deck can simply do so much with the tools it has. Mix in the marriage of skill and luck that are expected from a Whole New World style deck, and it's surprising that Amber Steel isn't performing better. Now, to be fair, this deck does struggle against Ruby Sapphire and often Sapphire Steel, but it can also thrive versus Emerald Steel. And Steel does have the location busting power to slow down Ruby Amethyst. In fact, I think a well-tuned list can also really put the pain on an unsuspecting Sapphire Steel player as well. That is, of course, if they don't manage to find their cogsworths too quickly. It could be argued that Amber Steel has the most flexible early game of any top deck right now. After all, when it comes to the big 4, each of those decks has such a dedicated and specific game plan that they attempt to accomplish within the first few turns. Meanwhile, Amber Steel has an interesting mix of reactive lines. On the defensive end, early singers Cinderella and Vanessa help get early Steel songs into play. Between Storm, Strength, and then along came Zeus on turns 2 and 3, shutting down opponents' early game plans is a walk in the park. Alternatively, early games can be used to set up your own plan, with Floodborn targets like Robin Hood and the Queen shifting up to sing A Whole New World to refill your hand with more gas. During all of this Amber Steel deck looks to weave in diversified threats, with Sleepy's Flute and Pride Lands ready to turn up the pressure. There's all of this, and I didn't even mention the amazing Ariel Spectacular Singer, who has always been the lifeblood of this deck. Take all of this and throw in more tech potential with Bare Necessities, World's Greatest Criminal Mind, perhaps even Rise of the Titans or Benja if needed. With all this in mind, it's almost unbelievable that this deck has yet to really perform even close to other top tier decks in the meta. I do think one problem is that this deck simply needs a strong pilot, but I also think this lack of success is just further evidence that the big 4 decks truly are very good and very consistent. They're simply a tier above the rest of the competition. So what do you think? Are the big 4 really this dominant that they deserve that title? And if there is a clear 5th deck in the meta, what's your pick for that final spot? Will Steel Song rise up once more as it always does? Or does another deck deserve that spot in the top 5? Let me know down below in the comments. Also, let me know what you think will win the majority of the upcoming set championships. I'd love to read all of your predictions. And now this is the part of the video where I'm supposed to record an outro, but I'm not really sure what to say today, so like and subscribe if you want to. Goodbye.